This is the small town of Thornton. It is a city under development and still in the foundational stages. This city will be built alongside actual city planning knowledge, dialogue, and graphics from a university master's level module. Each episode will focus on a different part of the city and a different level module. Learn about real city planning knowledge and implement that into your own city. But I will be doing so into Thornton. Our first lesson starts with the basis of understanding a city, and that, in the city planning jargon, is called the site context. Think of your local neighbourhood. It's likely made up of a complex array of the following contextual factors. Number 1, services, supermarkets, childcare, pubs and restaurants. 2, amenities like parks, views and bike paths. 3, public goods such as schools, crime protection, stormwater drainage systems. 4, positive market spillovers like neighbouring homes that are more lavish and expensive. 5, disamenities. This includes traffic congestion, airport noise, sewage smells. 6, negative market spillovers. Neighbouring businesses that generate loud drunken patrons at 2 a.m, for example, or industrial sites that generate high levels of airborne particles. And finally, environmental vulnerabilities. Flood-prone areas, slip zones, and bush or wildfire-prone areas too. We all have a sense of how these varied aspects of the places we inhabit coexist and are traded off. But how can we analyze these multi-dimensional places to lay the empirical foundations for urban design and planning? If we don't understand the constraints or threats a site might pose, we may make disastrous design and planning decisions. This is what we mean by due diligence, identifying and accurately estimating the various risks a particular action entails. Equally, however, if we don't recognize the strengths and opportunities a site may offer, we may have too limited a view of site suitability, not just what it could be used for, but also how it might add to our sense of delight, connection with nature, or even with the past. This place is because Ian McHarg, in his classic book Design with Nature from 1969, argued that planners and designers needed to be able to explain this place is because ... Finding the reason that a place initially attracted humans can cast a new light on its subsequent history. McHarg conceptualized each element of the natural, human, and built environments as a series of transparencies that, overlaid on one another, explain the uniqueness of each site. He is often considered the grandfather of GIS. Adding a historical lens, McHarg argued we also need to visualize how each of those elements has evolved over time. A map of current vegetation showing vulnerable and protected species and areas of invasive weeds is underlaid in turn by an imaginary series of historical maps showing the changes the vegetation has undergone, from native bush and scrub to clearance by settlers, to pasture, to clearance by bushfires, to suburban backyards, and then poorly managed street vegetation. The same site could be mapped according to its built environment elements. Currently a mix of 10-year-old townhouses adjacent to a zone of low-density detached housing with some remnant water control measures on site. The historical series underlying this current picture might show 19th century efforts to control minor flooding by diverting streams into underground channels. So as you can see, it's all interconnected. But how to analyze site context and history? In your Cities Skylines game, before you even build anything, have a look at the site context, the lay of the land, or if you're redoing a site, also look at the site context before you start demolishing buildings. So how do we analyze? The first step is the lay of the land. What are the distinctive topographic features? Steeper slopes, low-lying areas. Topography is indicated by contour lines on a map, and thank God we got them back in the game. The steeper a slope, the closer together the contour lines. The more complex engineering will be required to build on it, and the more important becomes specialized advice from a geologist. Clay soils differ from granite. Roads and paths are usually routed along contours rather than at right angles to them. Contour lines can also indicate inactive watercourses and low-lying areas that might be vulnerable to flooding. So the first thing you need to do is turn on your contour lines. Then contamination. Almost all ex-industrial land and a large share of residential land poses geotechnical challenges. Understanding the nature of those challenges is essential. In many cases, they can be designed around. Is it possible this redevelopment site may be contaminated, you ask? Contamination may be caused by the industrial processes they use to house leaking underground storage tanks, water flow from contaminated neighboring properties, and many other sources like the sewage or the water pumps. Contamination is not constrained to sites of heavy industry. Dry cleaners and petrol stations are typical historical uses that are likely to be contaminated. Now, Cities Skylines isn't going to give you a full array of contamination data, but if you really want to go into this attacking it like a true city planner, have a think about the next petrol station you demolished and whether you're going to build a house on top of it. But even ex-residential uses pose dangers. Demolition waste from homes with asbestos insulation may have been disposed of on site. Not all contamination should be removed from a site. Sometimes it is safer to contain it on site and design around it. For instance, capping a hotspot with a hard surface parking lot. Each state has rigorous processes for investigation, assessment, and remediation depending on where you live. Designers and planners work with teams of specialists on an agreed plan of action. So, have you ever thought about the remediation process in City Skylines? Well, here's what it means. In many cases, remediating contaminants can take decades, requiring ongoing monitoring. It is complicated by the difficulty of tracing the source of contaminants, particularly waterborne substances. Hydrology. Is your site vulnerable to flooding? And I don't mean with City Skylines weird water physics, but still, have a look. Understanding hydrology is an essential first step in assessing risks and identifying suitable uses for a site. Hard and soft engineering can mitigate most risks, but at a cost. Look carefully at your site. How does water flow across it? So actually release some water over the land and then clear it away, just to see, especially in the game. Topography offers some clues to how this happens, but it interacts with soil type. For example, clay soils disperse water more slowly than sandy soils, and I have seen people build high-rises on the beach in City Skylines. Impervious surfaces, vegetation, and other factors come into play. Urban designers need to understand these hydrological processes and how changes to the site, for example, increased impermeable surfaces in the form of roofs, streets, and hard surface parking lots come into play. So the key takeaway from all of this, if you think your site in City Skylines has been contaminated, just build a parking lot over it. Next up on your City Skylines site context is archaeological and historical features. Now, starting a new map in City Skylines 2, you will find some buildings and some features that have been left on the map. Should you leave them? Should you destroy them? What right do you really have with them? So, does the site that you are looking at have significant archaeological features? If there are any indications that this might be the case, it will be important to understand that there is legal frameworks that must protect these sites and resources before you do anything. Beyond a purely legalistic response, the varied heritage of human settlement or use of a site offers a fascinating perspective on how it has evolved and its changing significance for humans. A professional assessment of the site's history and significance is a crucial part of understanding the design and planning possibilities before you do anything. Next up is vegetation. What types of vegetation are on your proposed site? Do any areas need special protection in their own right or because they provide crucial habitat for protected species? How much of the existing vegetation can be preserved through sensitive design solutions as opposed to destroying things? What opportunities, for example, for natural shading and privacy does this existing vegetation offer what you plan on building? Next up is the neighbourhood context. Why does neighbourhood character matter? And we're looking at a site within our Cities Skylines map that may be due for redevelopment, or you feel it requires gentrification. But before you do any of those things, you need to look at the character of the existing area. Does requiring new development to be compatible with the existing neighbourhood development in fact undermine efforts to preserve the integrity of historic neighbourhoods? This article here by Roger K. Lewis from the Washington Post reflects on the double-edged nature of the concept of neighbourhood compatibility. How does a proposed apartment building like this one here I'm hovering around with, or the construction of a medical centre, or the widening of an existing road fit into the current fabric of this neighbourhood? This will be an important question addressed in the assessment of any development application or DA, and an urban design proposal that doesn't consider the question of the neighbourhood character at the very start of the process may face significant obstacles by councils, no matter how useful the new proposed development is. So how do you define neighbourhood character? Looking at my Cities Skylines 2 city here, Thornton, here is a small section on the map. Here are 5 words that I would use to define it without any knowledge of neighbourhood character. Do you agree with the words that I've put up on screen to describe this section of my city? Rather than throw words around, let's look at the academic side of it first. A neighbourhood may be low density, with 4 homes per hectare, rolling terrain, wide streets in a curvature pattern with many cul-de-sacs and predominantly bush vegetation on the lots. Or it may be medium density terrace houses with typical lot sizes around 280 square metres, with narrow street grids, on-street parking, mature street trees and footpath gardens. Are these patterns relatively homogeneous, fragmented, or diverse, do you think? Are there dissonant elements disrupting this pattern? For example, look at this section. What if there was a few large new homes with narrow street setbacks that cover the majority of the site with hard surfaces and minimal vegetation? See how it doesn't match their neighbours? Or a car-oriented strip mall with hard surface parking that is put into this neighbourhood? Character statements set the context for development application DAs for new uses and densification, but they also have something important to tell us about high quality compatible redevelopment, the streetscape and the public realm. They offer urban designers subtle lessons about design approaches that enhance rather than undermine character. Consider the redevelopment of an old industrial site adjacent to a fine-grained neighbourhood of small 19th century terraced houses. There are significant differences in bulk and scale between new high-rise, bulky historic warehouses and the small-scale terrace houses in the adjacent neighbourhood. So how do you write a character statement? A neighbourhood character statement is not intended to point out the emotional attachments that residents have to their place and surroundings, rather it is a statement of fact. Think of it instead as an abstraction from many specific examples of character you may know. Your character statement should explain the place and allow an outsider to get a visual representation without ever being there. So what is suburb character? What other assets and deficits characterize your suburb? Beyond the bounds of the site and its immediate neighborhood, transport connections, open space networks and employment centers, a hierarchy of retail services, or locally unwanted land uses called LULUs, which are landfills, airports, heavy industry, they bring amenity, essential services, but also disamenity. These attributes form part of the design brief. How can the effects of a heavily trafficked arterial be minimized through site landscaping, orientation, physical barriers, or construction materials? How should an urban designer use a linear park to maximize the amenity brought by connection to a regional bike path? How do new public spaces relate to significant environmental features such as the waterfront or native scrubland? Next, the site context considers transport connections. What sorts of travel options do residents have? And a series of questions you need to ask. These are, is this a primarily car-dependent area, or are there a range of public transport options? And when you look at your transport, how frequent are transit links and what is their typical speed? How easy is it to transfer across modes, say from bus to train? What about the safety and appeal of biking and walking? But hello, Colossal Order, where's our biking? You're going against all urban planning, even American urban planning. Do local bike trails connect into a regional network? How walkable is the street network? How is parking distributed, and does it encourage or discourage single occupant car travel? How are the aesthetics of transport connections treated? And finally, how are the key transit nodes connected to other sorts of activities? These are just some of the questions you need to consider when you make your transport. Next, we turn to employment centres. How much employment is provided in the local area? Which occupations and industries dominate? Are local jobs exclusively in local service and retail, or are there a wider range of job types, say connected to other regional centres or cities? Where is employment clustered? In high local streets? In a suburban business district, or in a regional office or industrial park, or even in a large institution, say a hospital, university, or prison? How does that location affect travel to work patterns? What types of jobs dominate? Full-time, permanent, and well-paid, or unstable and part-time? Is there a reasonable balance between inbound and outbound commuters, or is this a bathroom suburb? Are there opportunities to preserve or add employment space, perhaps for less well-provided creative and startup space, or space to accommodate hybrid working? These are just some of the questions that you need to answer about your employment centres. Next, you need to think about the open space network. How much open space is provided per person in the suburb? And how does this compare with standard levels of provision? What types are provided? Do you just have pocket parks, neighbourhood sports fields, passive green space? Do you have rewild habitat, regional destination parks? How are these different types of open space connected to form walking trails, flood management services, and uninterrupted wildlife routes? What are the gaps in these provisions, and what opportunities exist to add to this network? Next, your site context and your character statement needs to focus on the retail and services. What scale are the essential, these ones, and the basic retail and services in your suburb? Are they mostly large supermarkets, hardware stores and similar, or a mix of sizes, or predominantly all small scale? What range do they serve? What is the mix of retail and services? Is there anything distinctive about them that defines your neighbourhood character? How are they distributed spatially? Are they concentrated in a few locations, or primarily evenly distributed across the area? How are they accessed? Is it mainly by car or on foot, or by public transport? Do they generate traffic, and to what extent do previous design decisions exacerbate or ameliorate traffic problems? I know these are a lot of questions for you to answer, but this is what you need to consider if you want to play Cities Skylines with a city planner lens. And the final set of questions for your character statement include essential, but the unwanted facilities. These include cell phone towers, landfills, sewerage treatment works, overhead power lines, cement plants, construction staging areas, petrol refineries, power station and transmissions lines. These are what are called LULUs, locally unwanted land uses. Without these, civilized life as we know it, like internet and phone services, flushing toilets, weekly waste pickups, would not exist. Public emotion about the polluting or otherwise noxious externalities of these essential utilities runs high in most communities. So how do urban planners and designers deal with such a conundrum, and especially the disdain that comes from the community? We all need these services, but none of us want to live near them. Real estate markets can very effectively resolve this problem for people, the richer people, who can bid high enough to live away from these LULUs, but the resulting environmental injustice is an unacceptable cost for many who must live near these things. For decades, cities sequestered these services to be put on leftover land or in poorer areas, particularly around ports. But waterfront land has become too valuable to developers and communities wanting walkable parks to neglect, and the original engineering collateral of the power stations and treatment works that was often in this area has now become obsolete. The key takeaway there is to not put your industry on the waterfront, but to rather capitalize on the waterfront as a real estate and developer and community asset. The image of the city. There are 5 elements to city navigation. Kevin Lynch argued that people navigate through cities based on 5 key elements of the city image: paths, nodes, edges, district, and landmarks. His book, The Image of the City, shown here, is based on interviews with residents of Boston, Los Angeles, and Jersey City, and presents a unique perspective on how we make sense of places, why we feel confident in some places and disorientated in others, and how it differs at different scales. What is legible for the driver of a car may be confusing for a pedestrian, and vice versa. The 5 principles can be used to capture the structure of cities and analyze their design DNA. Lynch asked a series of questions aimed at eliciting psychological and emotional responses to place. Take these questions and answer these about your very own Cities Skylines city. How legible is your cityscape? How easily are its parts recognized and organized into a coherent pattern? How imaginable is the cityscape? Does it have identity, structure, meaning? Is the image open-ended, adaptable? Is it complex? Can you communicate it? We must learn to see the hidden forms in the vast sprawl of our cities. Lynch sets out to consider the visual quality of the American city by studying the mental image of that city which is held by its citizens. He interviewed 30 people from Boston and 15 each from Jersey City and LA, asking them to draw a map to describe their city. These visual images were consolidated, and field analysis drew conclusions about the structure of the cities. In this diagram, Lynch summarizes the analysis of Boston. It is a graphic compilation of what seem to be the major difficulties in the city image. There's confusion, floating points, weak boundaries, isolations, breaking continuity, ambiguities, branch-ins, lack of character or differentiation. Like a site analysis, it does not determine a plan, but it is the background upon which creative decisions can be made. Despite these flaws, the consolidated map of Boston showed a densely knit fabric of detail. Amongst the interviewees, the collective mental map of the city was coherent. In contrast, the consolidated map of Jersey City had far fewer fine-grained areas of detail. Lynch comments damningly, "To the usual formlessness of space of structure that mark the blighted area of any American city is added the complete confusion of an uncoordinated street system. The drabness, the dirt, and smell of the town are at first overpowering." Does this sound like American cities to you? Boston's fine-grained texture and walkable structure are evident in this photo from 1960. In contrast, an aerial perspective of Jersey City in 1964 explains the sparsity of the collective mental map Lynch elicited. The waterfront, defined by wharves rather than a clear water's edge, is hard to place, and the dominance of aerial highways rather than walkable streets may also help account for the sparsely populated mental images Lynch mapped. So how is the image of a city constructed? The 5 elements we spoke about. Lynch's next step was to analyze the images to identify the elements that his interviewees used to describe their image of their city. The 5 elements he highlights have become indispensable building blocks for urban designers and city planners: paths, edges, districts, nodes, and landmarks. Paths identify continuity, visual hierarchy, clear direction, strong termini, directional differentiation, scale and orientation, a sense of movement, clear visual joints, identify networks, and melodic form. Next is edges, which can either contain continuity, visibility, or may seem like a barrier and have lack of accessibility. Third is landmarks, and the problem with landmarks is that they are often concentrated in clusters and people form around those landmarks, rather have them spread and constructed around a city. Fourth is nodes. They are conceptual anchor points and they link structures together. They have sharper boundaries and they are coherent spatial forms. Finally, there is districts, which have a homogeneous character, along with a few dimensions. These are commonly used and they are recognized by a status by normal citizens and even tourists. They have defined closed boundaries like we use in Cities Skylines, but often within a district there are many sub-districts. So when building your city in Cities Skylines, you may look at building blocks and see that they are designed at different scales. Which one do you prefer and which one do you use? There is pedestrian scale paths, landmarks, edges and districts. Or there is the car scale paths, edges, districts and landmarks. Take a look at these images and see if you can identify the 5 elements that I've just listed. Let's go through them. So as you watched me build Thornton and talk about city planning, we started thinking about how to read cities and how to use communication skills like drawing to tell stories about our cities. So can we now complete Ian McHarg's sentence? The place is because...